Dr. J. Michael Waller is one of the most proficient and certainly most knowledgeable and creative of warriors in the War of Ideas, bar none. And it is a great privilege to have him with us today to talk about another, as it turns out, enormously influential warrior in the War of Ideas, unfortunately for the other side, Saul Alinsky, a man we've heard a fair amount about of late for his past association with President Obama and others in the Obama administration. We're going to drill down deeply into what Saul Alinsky was all about, what his rules for radicals entailed, how it is apparently influencing the Obama administration, and then we're going to conclude with what the rest of us could be doing. Those who love America, those who want it to succeed in the war we're in, War of Ideas and the old-fashioned kind, kinetic war, how we might make use of the insights and the intriguing ideas of Saul Alinsky for good.
He was born in Chicago about 100 years ago and was a criminologist who spent a lot of time first around crooked Chicago and then around the prison systems. And from there, he learned the value.
Including, I'm told, with Al Capone and his gang. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, he actually worked with the Capone gang in prison as a criminologist, and so he was exposed to them and how they were able to take over the city of Chicago. So basically, you've got a political organizer who of the far left who cut his teeth hanging out with the likes of Al Capone. He then organized.
That's pretty ominous.
Yep, but that's how he. And that's even in his official biography. He then worked organizing the poor during the Depression in Chicago and working with some of the communist-controlled unions like the CIO and fighting the anti-communists, and then ultimately later on started working among minority groups, both black and Latino, to really basically start race wars for the political empowerment and the radicalization of those communities, because both the black communities and the Latino communities were quite conservative socially and culturally, and he radicalized them and helped breed this whole new generation that emerged in the 1960s of extreme left leadership. He was really a pioneer of community organizing on a mass scale, and he set up a school in Chicago specifically to train community organizers from seminaries, from racial minority groups, from ethnic groups, from all different kinds of social organizations and labor unions, and really radicalized them. So he is unashamed of the term radical. So his manual used rules for radicals, which he came out as sort of as a strategy guide for radicals, it's sort of a how-to guide to take advantage of differences in society, exacerbate those differences, personalize issues, target individuals for character assassination in order to make a political issue of something, and then just simply radicalize and polarize events so that you can get your way. He was very proud of his use of underhanded tactics, a lot of sleazy stuff that, believe me, if the CIA was doing this, our guys would be put on trial for it. He trained a whole.
Well, let's talk about that.
Political power.
Yeah, we're gonna come to that in just a moment. But just, I think the point that you just made is so instructive. This guy had actually a rule for radicals that says, quote, this is number 13 in a list of 13, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. In conflict tactics, there are certain rules that should be regarded as universities. One is that the opposition must be singled out as the target and frozen. This really, it seems to me, has come to define the kind of politics of personality and the like that we've heard so much about of late. Give us a sense of how, in the hands of an Alinsky, that would be operationalized, or one of his acolytes.
Well, let's say you opposed, you wanted to help free the terrorists in Guantanamo. You can't come out and say, I want to freeze the terrorists in Guantanamo. So you take an issue, say an American principle, and these people are being denied their right to due process. And then you make a big stink about that being an anti-American principle. But then you personalize it by blaming somebody who can easily be caricatured, or who doesn't handle the press very well, or who doesn't like to be in the press, and who really might be a great person but is not good on his feet in terms of dealing with the media. And in this case, they said something like, this is all Dick Cheney's fault. And they polarized it. And a guy like Dick Cheney doesn't mind being the bad guy. He needed to do what was right. But what an Alinsky would do is exploit that and say, look at him. Look at that scowl on his face. Look how secretive he is. And make it seem like something completely subversive and un-American and totally unappealing. You're trying to peel away the squishy center and the middle of the rotors and the weak links. And the more you can peel them away, the more you can weaken your opponent. So you'll have people say, oh, you don't support Cheney's policy, do you? That's all Cheney. You see how the whole war against terrorism had been reduced by the Alinskyites to Dick Cheney and that scowling, nasty man. You can't let on as to how radical your agenda is, or you're going to lose a lot of people. So you camouflage it. You speak in vague, visionary terms, trying to provide as few specifics as possible for people to quibble about, and then you try to ram it through. Because in Alinsky's words, you're organizing for political power. And once you have power, you cannot keep power unless you expand your power. Mm-hmm. And this is the whole crux of the healthcare debate today, because it's a question of political power and political control over people's lives. And once people become dependent on this government system, they're not going to vote for politicians who want to take it away from them.
Right, and this is clearly part of the direction that we see the Obama administration moving now in not only the healthcare debate, but in terms of what has been described as sort of socializing other parts of our economy and putting more and more and more people in a position where they're either receiving directly benefits of one form or another, subsidized grants, what have you, from the government,
right? Or
they're simply not paying taxes to the government. And I'm told that one of the things that is really quite stunning is the extent to which the percentage of people in the country that will pay no taxes at all is moving inexorably towards 50%. This would seem to be, again, right out of the Alinsky playbook.
Well, it is, because he specifically says throughout the book he's trying to pit the have-nots against the haves, simply because there are far more have-nots than there are haves. So you attack the haves as being greedy because they have power, or they have whatever it is they have, and you prey on the desires and aspirations of those who don't have, and then you get the haves, you force the haves really to pay for the agenda that benefits the have-nots, who become your political strength. They become your muscle. They become your voters.
Right, and your base for imposing your will on others through presumably the democratic process, but not necessarily.
Right. Yeah, he says here, democracy is not an end; it is the best political means available.
This guy has understood some of the fundamentals of the use of power and how, as you say, to expand it at the expense of the democratic and certainly the accountable and representative kind of government we've had to this point. And I must say, and we'll talk more about this in just a moment, there's a lot to be learned from all of this.
Well, this fall, for example, in one of my classes, the students are studying Saul Alinsky, how to understand him, with the idea of how to fight those types of tactics when the enemy uses them against us. For example, Hamas and Hezbollah are pure Alinsky in terms of a lot of their political warfare tactics. Al-Qaeda has even taken what arguably could be are consistent with Alinsky tactics, and certainly we know from their captured training manuals that they pay attention to a lot of radical Marxist political organizing propaganda in terms of developing their own propaganda doctrine. So I wouldn't be surprised if they studied Alinsky. But also to take Alinsky's ideas, just as you would imagine, you're in the battlefield and you drop your weapon, but you capture the enemy's weapon and you use it against him. It's the same idea, taking Alinsky's weaponized ideas and using them against the enemy.
Well, let's get some specific suggestions here. Take the enemy as I think it is properly defined, Mike, as adherents to this program that authoritative Islam calls Sharia, this theopolitical, legal, military, comprehensive program for running everything from how people pray to how the world is run. Take this as a font of the enemy's intellectual energy, its ambitions, its compulsion to engage in jihad of either the violent or the stealthy kind, and tell us how you might use Alinsky's techniques to try to counter that program and its adherents.
Sure. We'll start with examples here at home, because as Alinsky would say, you always start out with an experience that's familiar to your audience. So I would imagine most of the audience has not lived in Afghanistan or Iraq or someplace. So, but in the United States, they readily understand it. So you have some radical organizer from the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, which also looks like an Alinskyite operation. And they're the ones who try to bully us into accepting all this weird, extreme views and policies in the name of civil rights and in the name of American tolerance and the so-called separation of church and state, meaning CARE is not coming out and saying, hey, we're a pro-terrorist front operation and we want to Islamicize your country by hook or by crook. They don't come across that way. They say, we're a civil rights group and we just want civil rights for Muslim people in America. Well, most Americans can accept that second argument. We're not going to accept, hey, we want to Islamicize your country and replace the Constitution with the Quran. First, because that would be a crime.
Though that is their purpose.
Even though it's their purpose.
That is, in fact, their stated purpose.
But they don't go around saying that in their press releases all the time. And if you try to pin them on it, they'll deny it or try to worm their way out of it. But that's their stated purpose.
Correct.
But they're never going to get anywhere by coming out and saying that front and center. So they use stealth. They use subterfuge. And then when people like you, Frank, stand up to them and call them on it, they're not going to engage in a reasoned argument. Alinsky says, don't try to engage in reasoned arguments with your opponents. The idea is to vilify them, marginalize them, break them psychologically, grind down their supporters, and make them just tiresome for everybody to have to listen to. And so that's precisely what CARE does. It takes the few people out there who stand up to them. And what do? Do they say, well, gee, we have different views of Frank Gaffney and we appreciate his views, but we really wish to be included in the debate? No, they say you're an anti-Semite, you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're a hater, you're anti-Islamic, you're an Islamophobe, or whatever other label they want to cast on you. What does that do immediately? That will get a sizable amount of the population who's going to agree with you in principle. They're not going to want to be tied to your argument now because they don't want to be tied to a racist, hater, prejudiced person. So that is Alinsky tactics number 1 and 2. Be vague, don't be truthful about what your radical agenda is, and then vilify your opponent to try to neutralize his effectiveness. So then that puts what would be a mainstream person way out on the fringe, and puts most other people on the defensive, and then they stumble all over themselves to prove how racist they aren't and how inclusive they are. And what does that do? They buy into CARE's agenda, its Islamist Sharia agenda simply because they don't want to be called racists and bigots, and they want to be perceived as inclusive. Well, what that does is
Michael
it breaks
Waller.
down the argument, and it breaks down the fairness and the reasonableness of the debate.
Yeah, that's clearly the purpose, is again, just as Alinsky says, to suppress our side. Going back at them, you would suggest doing what?
Oh, first, you identify an individual person within, say, the CARE leadership. Let's say someone who has been tied to terrorist groups or even put in prison because of terrorist ties. CARE has no shortage of those people in its leadership. And you just harp on the fact that this is a terrorist front organization. It has come here. It is people who have come to this country for the purpose of subverting our whole way of life and forcing Sharia on us, and they're tied to terrorism, and simply harp on that time and time and time again. We found, and I've seen how you do it, and the folks at the Center for Security Policy have been doing it for years, that really does put CARE on the defensive. And as happened with a previous Islamist group, or Islamist-run group, the American Muslim Council, I remember you harping on this particular issue on TV to the point where the American Muslim Council self-destructed because they started infighting because not everybody in the group was pro-terrorist, and in fact they started fighting among themselves and abolished their organization. So that was, you without even studying Alinsky, were able to use those same tactics against the Alinskyites who were trying to force things down our throats.
Well, thank you for that credit. I will have to tell you that the American Muslim Council was run by a man at the time, as you know, Mike Waller, by the name of Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, who actually was involved in terror and is now serving some 23 years in federal prison in connection with his criminal activity. So it was possible to say with quite considerable authority that that's what was going on there. And I'm afraid that what we've seen, probably in true Alinsky fashion, is many of those who were previously associated with that sort of umbrella Muslim Brotherhood organization migrating to other organizations and carrying on the fight at CARE and the Islamic Society of North America and the like. So the work continues, and the techniques that you're talking about require all of us to go to school on them and study up. Mike, I want to turn in a moment here to some specific further problem areas. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, Kim Jong-il of North Korea, and draw you out on how we in the United States might, by using Alinsky-esque techniques or simply engaging more effectively in political warfare, do far better than we appear to be doing at the moment.
Well, first of all, polarization, as Alinsky says, eliminates indecisiveness. And once you start talking about moderation and third way and all this other stuff, that ensures gridlock and indecisiveness. So part of the Alinsky formula is to polarize, especially when the other side has already staked out its claims to polarize. If we try to meet the enemy halfway, then we are giving the enemy 50%. As Alinsky would say, right. I demand 100%, but if I settle for 30%, that means I'm 30% ahead of my enemy. So what we're doing with this shenanigans in Geneva right now with Iran is really meeting Ahmadinejad's extreme agenda part way, which only plays into the hands of the bad guys.
Mike Waller, you have spent a lot of time in Latin America. You understand probably better than just about anybody else in the firmament of people concerned about national security policy and the practice of political warfare, how brilliantly the political warfare agenda of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela is being advanced in our hemisphere. Tell us a little bit about how you see him as a practitioner of this craft, if I can call it that, or art, and what could we be doing to Hugo Chavez to change, again, the program that he is pursuing with rather considerable success at the moment.
Sure. Well, Chavez himself is a great tactician. He's not such a great strategist, but he doesn't need to be, because his Cuban handlers are really, really fine strategists. So they do the deep thinking and the long-term thinking, and Chavez does the tactical stuff. But Chavez has a real weakness, and we can exploit that weakness at very little expense and at very little trouble, but we simply have never decided as a nation to do so. And that is, he has a huge ego and a very thin skin, and he cannot tolerate people making fun of him. Anytime you get a leader like that, you know that he has a vulnerability that you can exploit. Because as Alinsky would say, you vilify the target, ridicule becomes one of your most valuable assets, and that your real action is the enemy's reaction. So that, in his words, the enemy properly goaded and guided in his reaction will be your major strength. It is really easy to goad Hugo Chavez into overreacting and then to allow him to set himself up as an object of ridicule, something that he just can't tolerate.
Yeah. You know, I'm looking at Rules for Radicals, and Saul Alinsky's rule number 5 was exactly that. Quote, ridicule is man's most potent weapon. It is almost impossible to counteract ridicule. Also, it infuriates the opposition, which then reacts to your advantage. So give us an example, Mike Waller, of how one might use ridicule to exploit this vulnerability of Hugo Chavez to our advantage.
Well, here's one idea. He likes to fashion himself as a common man of the people. Yet once he was photographed wearing a Rolex watch, and he reacted so extremely when his critics started saying, "Well, you're not a real proletarian. You're wearing a Swiss watch," that he cracked down on that, and he said no more images must be published of him wearing a Swiss watch. He also, his opponents also created a Hugo Chavez action figure. Here he is, a paratrooper and so forth, the real macho man, and he fancies himself as even more macho than he is. But he's gotten a little paunchy in the 10 years he's been in power. So rather than have a big, buff, Hugo heroic figure, it was a paunchy, chubby guy with an exaggerated mole on his cheek. He's got a mole that he's sensitive about, and so this was an exaggerated one. And then you push a button, and he would say some slogans, but it was parodies of what Chavez was really saying, and it exaggerated the split between his front teeth, and the doll had a Rolex watch. So he couldn't stand that. So he had a crackdown against a doll.
Great. Mike Waller, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for this short course on Saul Alinsky and Rules for Radicals, how it's influencing the Obama administration, and by the way, influencing it to make exactly the wrong kinds of mistakes, wrong kinds of approaches to these characters. Instead of ridiculing Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Hugo Chavez and Kim Jong-il, they are lionizing them, building them up, negotiating with them, treating them as equals. A terrible mistake. Mike Waller, politicalwarfare.org. You are a national treasure, a great asset. Thank you for joining us here at Secure Freedom Radio.